Something I have always noticed about bar owners is that most check their pour cost monthly, and sometimes far after the end of the month because you're doing it based on your P&L, which means you find out about a problem long after the cost has affected your margins. And something you need to keep in mind, if your bar does $20,000 a week, a 5% difference between your actual and theoretical beverage cost is $1,000 a week walking out your door. Pour cost is the number one thing that we can control, and it's one of the hardest things to control. So today we're going to talk all about pour cost. Welcome to the Bar Business Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Schneider, the Bar Business Coach. And if you're tired of figuring out every bar problem alone, well, join Bar Business Nation, our free Facebook group for bar owners who want better ideas and real conversations. The link's in the show notes. Today on the Bar Business Podcast, we're talking about how to calculate pour cost correctly, category level targets, how to put in place a variance tracking system, and operational controls that actually work. As I mentioned in the intro, so many people I talk to, we have these product issues. And something that I've seen recently in a few different clients that is something to keep in mind is if you see your average check slipping down, a lot of times that's correlated with your pour cost, because what's happening in reality is your bartenders are pouring a little bit more than they should. People are getting intoxicated a little bit quicker, drinking fewer drinks, and then they're not buying that third drink or that fourth drink that they would normally buy if you were following your standards. So a declining check average can be the effect of your pour cost. Combine that now when you have more cost per drink, it's going to throw your margins, your revenue, everything into chaos. So unless you're controlling your pour cost, you're really not controlling your business. Now, as we get started today, first thing I want to talk about is how do you calculate pour cost correctly? And the answer is it's not what you purchased. Right? A lot of us go, well, I bought 10 grand worth of booze this week or this month, so my pour cost was $10,000. No. You have to do the cost of goods sold equation. Beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory equals cost of goods sold. Beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory equals cost of goods sold. That's the actual dollar value that walked out of your bar. Now, there's two key pieces there, beginning inventory and ending inventory. If you are not taking a regular, complete, thorough inventory, and I really think you should do it on a weekly basis. A lot of people don't like that, but it really should happen on a weekly basis. You are not tracking your pour cost. You're tracking some analog of it. But when we're in a business where 2 or 3%, the difference between you struggling for the year as an owner and you taking your family on a nice vacation, you got to track it. You have to be on top of it. The risk to you is too big unless you actually dive in and understand and make the effort to get pour cost accurate by understanding that beginning and ending inventory. Again, the biggest mistake I see here is people use purchase cost instead of actual usage. What you bought this month and what you use this month are never the same. So you have to do the inventory. Now, once we have that cost of goods sold number, we turn that into a pour cost by dividing it by revenue and then multiplying it by 100, right? The math there is simple. But every week you should be doing this physical inventory count so that you have a real idea of what your actual usage is. Now, what should we be looking for in these numbers? Right? What are some targets that make sense? And I will warn you, targets vary greatly across the country and based on your business model. I know folks that own bars that they've owned for 50 years where they own the real estate and their costs are like nothing to maintain that property. They can afford a higher pour cost and therefore give their customers cheaper drinks because their cost structure allows them. I know other folks in New York City that are paying astronomical rents and they got to charge their customers a lot. And that pour cost needs to be a lot lower because their cost of the occupancy of their building is much higher on a percentage basis. So whenever we talk about target numbers, realize that, I'm going to give you some ranges that are pretty general, but your exact concept, your occupancy cost, your location in the country, your labor cost because of your location in the country or around the world, all of those are going to impact what this target should actually be. And I say this because, it's a huge thing in my book. You're not ever trying to beat an industry average. You shouldn't ever trying to be beating the guy down the street. You should be trying to beat who you were yesterday, making your numbers better. So, if we're starting with a 35% pour cost, which that ain't going to work for anybody, Just getting it down to 30% is a huge win, even if we're long-term targeting 22%. So let me give you some of these numbers. If we're talking about a blended pour cost, like across the board between beer, wine, and liquor, obviously your product mix is going to play in a little bit here, but blended wise, we want to be somewhere in the 24 to 26% range. That's healthy and comfortable for most bars. Now, when it comes to liquor alone, a lot of times we want to be in that 18 to 22. Why? Because liquor, honestly, we're putting some effort into our cocktails. So there's some labor there. Also, it's where you have the best margins, generally speaking. If you're running north of 27% on liquor, that's usually an indication to me that we need to change something or we need to look at standards, things of that nature. When it comes to beer, 24, 28% is kind of the range I generally think about. Now, a lot of this depends on how much you're discounting, how much you can charge, right? Obviously, New York City and rural Oklahoma are going to have much different beer pour costs. But that 24 to 28 is comfortable for most folks. An interesting thing that's also true, back in the day, it was very true that kegs were way cheaper than packaged liquor. Today, we all know that's not actually the case. So, for everything, we can be in that 24 to 28% range. But the biggest mistake when it comes to looking at draft beer, especially when you're pricing draft beer, is to assume 100% yield, right? A bottle of beer is one of the best things in this industry to sell because I'm pouring that properly every time because I just open it. And 12 ounces is 12 ounces. But when we start talking about draft beer, now we're in a spot where there's a lot of potential loss. And so my rule of thumb is to always assume a 90% yield and hope I get better. Does that mean my prices might be a little higher than the guy down the street sometimes? But usually I can price it at 90% and still match. But at the same time, I'm already accepting the fact that there's going to be foam and waste involved in draft beer. When it comes to wine, the big band that I like to look at is right around that 27 to 30%. Why so high? Because generally speaking, in most bars, we're pouring wine that's a little pricey and we can't quite charge, a higher multiple. The other problem with wine is that if I open a bottle, I now have a clock on that bottle to serve it. And if I'm not selling a lot of wine, that wine sometimes is going to turn into vinegar before I have a chance to actually pour it. But the big thing to take away from this is you have to break things down by category because each of these categories is going to behave a little bit differently. Each of them has a different cost structure. Each of them has different potential problems that are going to make your cost higher. So unless you break that down, you can't root cause, you cannot fix problems that exist in your pour cost. Now, something I wish everyone in the industry did, and this is a bit of a pain in the ass, but I still think you should do it, is a weekly variance tracking system. Now, when I say variance, what do I mean? I mean your actual versus your theoretical. Actual being that cost of goods sold equation, right? Beginning inventory plus purchases minus ending inventory equals cost of goods sold. Take that, divide it by revenue, multiply that by 100, and I now have a percentage that is my actual pour cost. But just knowing your actual doesn't tell you how you did, right? Because as I mentioned, what your pour cost should be can vary widely. The question is, does your actual differ from your theoretical? Now, to get your theoretical, you're going to take a P-mix off your computer, off your POS, and you're going to do the same math slightly differently. You're going to say, okay, this is what I should have sold, right? I sold 5 Budweisers. What do 5 Budweisers cost me? I sold 15 espresso martinis. These are the ingredients in it. Each ingredient costs X. Here's what that should have cost me. And you add this stuff all together until you figure out, well, I should have spent X number of dollars on beverages in the last week. Take that number, you divide it by the revenue, you multiply it by 100, and now I got another percentage. And we want to see what that delta is, the difference between the actual and the theoretical. In an ideal world, it would be 0%. But let's be honest, human interaction, spills, all sorts of things happen that are going to make that not 0%. My general cutoff is 3%. If it's less than 3%, it's not a big deal. We can worry about that a different day. If it's more than 3%, we have a serious problem we need to solve. And if it's above 5 or 6%, we have a crisis because that is money walking out your door. And again, on $20,000 a week in volume, we're talking about $1,000 a week that's walking out the door. So whatever day you do your inventory, do your count, pull your P-mix, figure your actual and theoretical, and then compare the two. There are ways to get your count to be very quick. There's technology you can use, different things. And if you can Make that count quick. That gives you time to do the actual work that's going to tell you what you need to do to drive your business forward. So let's say you do all this and you go, hey, my actual and theoretical, they're 4.5 points apart. I need to figure this out. What are some operational controls that you can actually use to move these numbers? Well, the first one is, how are you pouring? So whether we're free pouring, whether we're using jiggers, there are pros and cons to both. And frankly, I think there's a place for both. As a neighborhood bar, my bars, we only free poured. Why? Because you should be able to count. And that's a skill that a lot of times has gotten thrown out in today in favor of jiggers. But if we're using jiggers, we need to be trained on how to use them. You need to understand where that line is and what it means. You need to understand, is your jigger accurate? There was an episode I did a few years ago with Chris Tunstall, who owns a bar above, and they sell a lot of bar equipment. And he had gone and bought a bunch of jiggers off Amazon and figured out the average variance in the jigger. If you just compared actual volume versus what the jigger said the volume was 10%. So using a jigger, while it sounds like, oh, this is going to eliminate all the variance, it only eliminates variance if the jigger itself is accurate. So use jiggers, use free pouring, do whichever, but make sure you're doing it accurately. With free pouring, I am a huge fan of pour tests on a regular basis with your team. If they don't know how to count and pop out a half ounce or count and pop out an ounce or an ounce and a half, they probably shouldn't be behind your bar. This is, in my mind, base level bartender skills that we should expect out of every person we put behind a bar. Now, what else can we look at? Well, one of the big ones that I see on a frequent basis is that comps and wastes are not being logged properly. Every time something gets spilled, a bottle gets broken in the back room, anytime anything happens where that liquor is no longer usable, or that beer is no longer usable, that wine, right? The wine turns. It needs to be logged and rung in, right? In your POS, you can set up a spill and waste comp, and you just ring everything in that is spills and waste. Why? Because now your POS contains all the data, and when you go to pull that P-mix, you're actually comparing apples to apples. Your actual and your theoretical can speak to each other. If you're not logging waste, if you're not ringing in your spills, and that's not in the data, then that comparison has zero validity. And quite frankly, you're not doing anything that's going to make a difference. So you need to make sure you are always figuring out what is that difference, how do I measure it, and that every single spill, waste, every drop of liquor that leaves a bottle is recorded. Another place, and this is a little bit more back office, but receiving controls. Just because you order something doesn't mean it gets delivered. I think we all know that. And especially when we're dealing with split cases of booze where you're buying, 12 different bottles, maybe one of them gets screwed up, right? Maybe the supplier sends you the wrong thing. So if you're not really checking in every bottle when it comes in the door, if you're not paying attention to your receiving, well, your costs, your inventory could be total bullshit. And you could have extra waste and spillage. You could have products you don't even want or that you didn't even order because you're not paying attention to what comes in the door. And the last thing that I think is a big operational control is staff knowledge. Your bartenders need to not just understand that they have to pour properly. They need to understand how their poor decisions connect to bad cost and, quite frankly, can hurt their tips as well. I hear a lot, well, my bartenders, sometimes they top up or they pour more for good regulars. Okay, if that's part of the system, let's figure that out. Let's track it. Let's monitor it. Let's have that recorded properly. But just randomly overpouring for some people and not others, it's not really helping anybody. Because your bartenders make more money when they get more tips. More tips comes from higher sales. Higher sales comes from selling more drinks. Selling more drinks does not come from giving people too much booze in a single drink. It comes from giving them the right amount of booze in a perfect drink consistently. Because like I said at the beginning, overpouring invariably leads to fewer drinks being sold, lower check averages, and for your staff, lower tips. What's funny is a lot of bartenders think it actually leads to higher tips. I have not seen that in my years, right? I pad these regulars and then they throw me $100. I know some people that do that, but 99 times out of 100, that ain't the case. Big thing here is make your pour cost a habit in your management. Make doing your inventory a habit in your management. Make doing the actual versus theoretical analysis a habit in your management. Because if you're doing that every week, you have a real chance to react to root cause the problems and to really get to a point where your actual and your theoretical are in line. And then you can look at things like pricing. You can look at things like what alcohol you're pouring in a drink. You can look at changing your cocktail menu to improve your margins. But until your inventory is tight, until you're actually in that theoretical and actual matching, you can do all of that on the pricing side. And none of it will solve your problem. It'll just move your problem to different product.
That about wraps it up for today. If you're tired of sorting through bar problems by yourself, come join us inside Bar Business Nation. It's our free Facebook group for bar owners and operators talking about what's working, what's not, and how to make the business easier to run. Search Bar Business Nation on Facebook, and I'll talk to you next time.